Hello there, William Golding with another chapter of Lord of the Flies. We'll be looking at chapter 8 today. But before we do, I want to give you a little bit of a summary of what we've seen with the beast so far. As I have stated to you in the past, the beast is a symbol of the fear that's present on the island, and that the boys are getting into conflicts with each other because of their fear of the unknown, their fear of never being rescued, the fear that they are afraid of themselves and their interactions with each other. They're afraid of the dark. So all these things are starting to build. Every time we've seen the beast thus far, we've seen the beast in the darkness, in low levels of light. We have not seen the full picture of what the beast really is. And we're going to see what the beast really is in chapter 8. Your essential question for chapter 8 will be, what does the Lord of the Flies symbolize? You're going to find out in this chapter why I titled the book Lord of the Flies. Here we go, chapter 8, Gift for the Darkness. Piggy looked up miserably from the dawn-pale beach to the dark mountain. Are you sure? Really sure, I mean? I told you a dozen times now, said Ralph. We saw it. Well, do you think we're safe down here? Well, how the hell should I know? Ralph jerked away from him and walked a few paces along the beach. Jack was kneeling and drawing a circular pattern in the sand with his forefinger. Piggy's voice came to them and hushed. Are you sure? Really? Well, go up and see, said Jack contemptuously, and good riddance. No fear. The beast had teeth, said Ralph, and big black eyes. He shuddered violently. Piggy took off his one round of glass and polished the surface. Well, what are we going to do? Ralph turned toward the platform. The conch glimmered among the trees, a white blob against the place where the sun would rise. He pushed back his mop. I don't know. He remembered the panicked flight down the mountainside. I don't think we'd ever fight a thing that size, honestly, you know? We'd talk, but we wouldn't fight a tiger. We'd hide. Even Jack could hide. Jack looked at the sand. Well, what about my hunters? Simon came stealing out to the shadows by the shelter. Ralph ignored Jack's question. He pointed to the touch of yellow above the sea. As long as there's light, we're brave enough. But then... And now that thing squats by the fire as though it doesn't want us to be rescued. He was twisting his hands now unconsciously. His voice rose. So we haven't got to signal fire. We're beaten. A point of gold appeared above the sea, and all at once the sky lightened. What about my hunters? Boys armed with sticks. Jack got to his feet. His face was red as he marched away. Piggy put on his one glass and looked at Ralph. Now you've done it. You've been rude about his hunters. Oh, shut up! The sound of an inexpertly blown conch interrupted them. As though he were serenading the rising sun, Jack went on blowing until the shelters were astir, and the hunters crept to the platform, and the Litlans whimpered, as now they did so frequently, and Ralph rose obediently and Piggy, and they went to the platform. Talk, said Ralph bitterly. Talk, talk, talk. He took the conch from Jack. This meeting, Jack interrupted him. I called it. Well, if you hadn't called it, I should have. You just blew the conch. Well, isn't that calling it? Oh, take it. Go on and talk. Ralph thrust the conch into Jack's arms and he sat down on the trunk. I called this assembly, said Jack, because of a lot of things. First, you know now that we've seen the beast. We crawled up. We were only a few feet away, and the beast sat up and looked at us. I don't know what it does. We don't even know what it is. The beast comes out of the sea, out of the dark, the trees. Quiet, shouted Jack. You listen. The beast is sitting up there, whatever it is. Perhaps it's waiting. Hunting. Yes, hunting. Hunting, said Jack. He remembered his age-old tremors in the forest. Yes, the beast is a hunter, only... Shut up! And the next thing is, we couldn't kill it. And the next is that Ralph said that my hunters are no good. I never said that. Well, I've got the conch. Ralph thinks that you're cowards, running away from the bull and from the beast, and that's not all. There was a kind of sigh on the platform, as if everyone knew what was coming. Jack's voice went up tremulously, and yet determined, pushing against the uncooperative silence. He's like Piggy. He says things like Piggy. He isn't a proper chief. Jack clutched to the conch to him. He's a coward himself. For a moment he paused and then went on. On top, when Roger and me went on, he stayed back. I went too. After. The two boys glared at each other through screens of hair. I went too, said Ralph, and then I ran away, and so did you. Well, call me a coward then. Jack turned to the hunters. He's not a hunter. He never got us meat. He isn't perfect, and we don't know anything about him. Yet he gives us orders and expects people to obey for nothing. All this talk, shouted Ralph. Talk! Who wanted it? Who called the meeting? Jack turned red in the face and his chin sank back. He glowered up under his eyebrows. All right then, he said in tones of deep meaning and menace. All right. Then he held the conch against his chest with one hand and stabbed in the air with his index finger. Who thinks Ralph oughtn't to be chief? He looked expectantly at the boys that ranged round, who had frozen under the palms, and there was deadly silence. Hands up, said Jack strongly. Whoever wants Ralph not to be chief. Silence continued, breathless and heavy and full of shame. Slowly the red drained from Jack's cheeks and then came back with a painful rush. Then he licked his lips, turned his head at an angle so that his gaze avoided the embarrassment of linking with another's eye. How many think? His voice trailed off. The hands that held the conch shook. He cleared his throat and spoke loudly. All right, then. He laid the conch with great care on the grass at his feet. The humiliating tears were running from the corner of each eye. I'm not going to play any longer. Not with you. Most of the boys were looking down now at the grass or at their feet. Jack cleared his throat again. I'm not going to be a part of Ralph's lot. He looked along the right-hand logs, numbering the hunters that had been in the choir. I'm going off by myself. He can catch his own pigs. Anyone else who wants to hunt when I do can come too. He blundered out of the triangle toward the top, to the white sand. Jack! Jack turned and looked back at Ralph, and for a moment he paused, and then he cried out in a high-pitched and enraged, No! He leapt down from the platform and ran along the beach, paying no heed to the steady fall of his tears, until he dived into the forest. Ralph watched him. I've been talking, Ralph, and you just stood there like... Softly looking at Piggy and not seeing him, Ralph spoke to himself. He'll come back. When the sun goes down, he'll come. He looked at the conch in Piggy's hand. What? Well, there. Piggy gave up the attempt to rebuke Ralph. He polished his glass again and went back to his subject.
We can do without Jack Merridew. There's others besides him on this island. But now we really got a beast, though I can hardly believe it. We'll need to stay close to the platform.
There's no help, Piggy. Nothing to be done. For a while they sat in depressed silence, and then Simon stood up and took the conch from Piggy, who was astonished that he remained on his feet. Ralph looked up at Simon. Simon? What is it this time? A half sound of jeering ran round the circle, and Simon shrank from it.
I think we ought to climb the mountain.
What's the use?
What else is there to do?
His speech made, he allowed Piggy to lift the conch out of his hand, and then he retired and sat away from the others as much as possible. Piggy was speaking now with more assurance, and with what, if circumstances had been so serious, the others would have recognized as pleasure. I said we could do without a certain person, and I say we got to decide on what can be done. And I think I can tell you what Ralph's going to say next. The most important thing on the island is the smoke, and you can't have no smoke without a fire. Ralph made a restless movement. No, go, Piggy. We got no fire. That thing sits up there, so we'll have to stay here. Piggy lifted the conch as though to add power to his next words. We got no fire on the mountain. But what's wrong with a fire down here? A fire could be built on them rocks, on the sand even. And we make smoke just the same. That's right. Smoke. By the bathing pool. And the boys began to babble. Only Piggy could have the intellectual daring to suggest moving the fire from the mountain. So we'll have the fire down here, said Ralph, as he looked about him, and we can build it just here between the bathing pool and the platform. Of course, he broke off, frowning, thinking the thing out, unconsciously tugging at the stub of a nail with his teeth. Of course, smoke won't show so much, not be seen so far away, but we needn't go near the... The others nodded in perfect comprehension. There would be no need to go near. We'll build the fire now. The greatest ideas are the simplest. Now there was something to be done, and they worked with passion. Piggy was so full of delight in expanding liberty and Jack's departure, so full of pride in his contribution to the good of society, that he helped to fetch wood. The wood he fetched was close at hand, a fallen tree on the platform that they did not need for the assembly, and yet the others' sanctity of the platform had been protected, what was useless, there. And then the twins realized that they could have a fire near them, and the comfort in the night, and this set a few litlins dancing and clapping hands. The wood was not so dry as the fuel that they had used on the mountain. Much of it was damply rotten and full of insects that scurried. Logs had to be lifted from the soil with care, and they crumbled into sodden powder. More than this, in order to avoid going deep into the forest, the boys worked near at hand on any fallen wood, no matter how tangled with new growth. The skirts of the forest and the sky were familiar, near the conch and the shelters, and sufficiently friendly in the daylight. And what might become in the darkness nobody cared to think. And they worked therefore with great energy and cheerfulness, though as this time crept by there was a suggestion of panic and energy and hysteria in the cheerfulness. They built a pyramid of leaves and twigs and branches and logs and the bare sand by the platform. And for the first time on the island, Piggy himself removed his one glass, knelt down and focused the sun on the tinder, and soon there was a ceiling of smoke and a bush of yellow flame. The Litlins, who had seen the few fires since the first catastrophe, became wildly excited, and they danced and sang, and there was a partyish air about the gathering. At last Ralph stopped work and stood up, smudging the sweat from his face with a dirty forearm. We'll have to have a small fire. This one's too big to keep up. Piggy sat down carefully on the sand and began to polish his glass. Well, we could experiment. We could find out how to make a small fire hot, and then put green branches on to make smoke. Some of them leaves must be better for that than the others." And as the fire died down, so did the excitement. The Litlins stopped singing and dancing and drifted away toward the sea or toward the fruit trees or the shelters. Ralph dropped down in the sand. "We'll have to make a new list of who's to look after the fire." "If you can find them." He looked round. Then he saw for the first time how few big uns there were, and understood why the work had been so hard. "Well, where's Morris?" Piggy wiped his glass again. "Well, I expect—" "No, he wouldn't go into the forest by himself, would he?" Ralph jumped up, ran swiftly around the fire, and stood by Piggy, holding up his hair. "But we got to have a list! There's you, and me, and Sam and Eric, and—" He would not look at Piggy, but he spoke casually. "Where's Bill and Roger?" Piggy leaned forward, put on a fragment of wood in the fire. "I expect they've gone. I expect they won't play either." Ralph sat down and began to poke little holes in the sand. He was surprised to see that he had a drop of blood by it. He examined his bitten nail closely and watched the little globe of blood that gathered where the quick was gnawed away. Piggy went on speaking. "I seen them stealing off when we was gathering wood. They went that way, same way as he went himself." Ralph finished his inspection and looked up at the air. The sky, as if in sympathy with great changes among them, was different today, and so misty in that same place that the hot air seemed white. The disk of the sun was a dull silver, as though it were nearer and not so hot. Yet the air stifled. "They've always been making trouble, haven't they?" The voice came near his shelter and sounded anxious. "Well, we could do without 'em. We'll be happier now. Won't we?" Ralph sat. The twins came, dragging a great log and grinning in their triumph, and they dumped the log among the embers so that the sparks flew. "We could do all right on our own, can't we?" For a long time, while the log dried, caught fire, and turned red, Ralph sat and said nothing. He did not see Piggy go to the twins and whisper to them, not how the three boys went together into the forest. "Here you are!" He came to himself with a jolt. Piggy and the other two were by him. They were laden with fruit. "I thought perhaps," said Piggy, "we ought to have a feast, kind of." The three boys sat down. They had a great mass of fruit with them, and all of it properly ripe, and they grinned at Ralph as though he took some, and he began to eat. "Thanks," he said, and then with an accent of pleased surprise, "Thanks." "Do all right on our own," said Piggy. "It's them that haven't got no common sense that make all the trouble on this island. We'll make a little hot fire." Ralph remembered what had been worrying him. "Where's Simon?" "I don't know." "You don't think he's climbing the mountain?" Piggy broke into noisy laughter and took more fruit. "He might be." He gulped a mouthful. "He's cracked." Simon had passed through the area of the fruit trees, but today the Litlins had been too busy with the fire on the beach that they had not pursued him there. He went on among the creepers until he reached the great mat that was woven by the open space and crawled inside. Beyond the screen of leaves, the sunlight pelted down, and the butterflies danced in the middle of their unending dance. He knelt down, and the arrow of the sun fell on him. That other time the air had seemed to vibrate with heat, but now it threatened. Soon the sweat was running from his long, coarse hair, and he shifted restlessly, but there was no avoiding the sun, and presently he was thirsty, and then very thirsty. And he continued to sit. Okay, so you need to get into your notes that one of the things that happens is Jack decides to leave the group, and Ralph, expecting that all the boys are going to rally together, and Piggy expecting all the boys to rally together to work together as a team, suddenly discover that there's more tension in the group than they realized, and that some of the bigger kids decide to go with Jack and form their own tribe. Meanwhile, Simon goes to his cabin in order to avoid all the drama that's happening between everybody. And he's debating on whether or not he wants to go to the mountain on his own. And that's where we pick up a very, for lack of better terms, a very dynamic scene, a very intense scene, and I want you to be prepared for it. It's quite an interesting display of inhumanity. Far off along the beach, Jack was standing before a small group of boys. He was looking brilliantly happy. "Hunting," he said. He sized them up. Each of them wore the remains of a black cap, and ages ago had stood in two demure rows, and their voices had been the song of angels. "We'll hunt. I'm going to be chief." They nodded, and the crisis passed easily. "And then, about the beast." They moved and looked at the forest. "I say this. We aren't going to bother about the beast." He nodded at them. "We're going to forget the beast." "That's right. Yes. Forget the beast." Jack was astonished by their fervor. He did not show it. "And another thing. We shan't dream so much down here. This is the near end of the island." They agreed passionately out of the depths of their tormented private lives. "And now listen. We might go later to the Castle Rock. But now I'm going to get more of the biggins away from the conch and all that. And we'll kill a pig and give a feast." He paused and went on more slowly. "And about the beast. When we kill, we'll leave some of the kill for it. And then it won't bother us. Maybe." He stood up abruptly. "And we'll go into the forest now and hunt." And he turned and trotted away. And after a moment, they followed him obediently. They spread out nervously in the forest. Almost at once, Jack had found dung and the scattered roots that told of a pig, and soon the track was fresh. Jack signaled the rest of the hunt to be quiet, and he went forward by himself. He was happy, and he wore the damp darkness of the forest like his own clothes. He leapt down onto the slope to the rocks and scattered the trees by the sea. The pigs lay, bloated bags of fat, sensuously enjoying the shadows under the trees. There was no wind, and they were unsuspicious, and practice had made Jack silent as shadows. He stole away again and instructed his hidden hunters, and presently they began to inch forward, sweating in the silence and the heat, and under the trees an ear flapped idly. A little apart from the rest, sunk in the deep maternal bliss, lay the largest sow of the lot. She was black and pink, and the great bladder of her belly was fringed with a row of piglets that slept, or burrowed, and squeaked. 15 yards from the drove, Jack stopped, and his arm, straightening, pointed at the sow. He looked round in inquiry to make sure that everyone understood, and the other boys nodded at him, and the row of right arms slid back. "Now!" And the drove of pigs started up, and the range of only 10 yards, wooden spears with flat, hardened points flew toward the chosen pig. One piglet, with a demented shriek, rushed into the sea, trailing Roger's spear behind it. The sow gave a gasping squeal and staggered up, with 2 spears sticking in her fat flank. The boys shouted and rushed forward. The piglets scattered, and the sow burst in the advancing line and went crashing away through the forest. "After her!" And they raced along the pig track, but the forest was too dark and tangled so that Jack, cursing, stopped them and cast among the trees. And then he said nothing for a time, but breathed fiercely so that they were awed by him and looked at each other in uneasy admiration. And presently he stabbed the ground with his finger. There. And before the others could examine the drop of blood, Jack swerved off, judging a trace, touching a bough that gave. And so he followed, mysteriously right and assured, and the hunters trod behind him. He stopped before a covert. In there. They surrounded the covert, but now the sow got away with the sting of another spear in her flank. The trailing butts hindered her, and the sharp crisscross points were a torment, and she blundered into a tree, forcing a spear still deeper. And after any of the hunters could now follow her easily by the drops of vivid blood. The afternoon wore on, hazy and dreadful with damp heat, and the sow staggered her way ahead of them, bleeding and mad, and the hunters followed, wedded to her in lust, excited by the long chase and the dropped blood, and they could see her now, nearly caught up with her. But then she sprinted with her last strength and held ahead of them again, and they were just behind her when she staggered into an open space where bright flowers grew and butterflies danced round each other, and the air was hot and still. Where are they? They're right outside Simon's cabin, so he witnesses this whole event taking place. Here, struck down by the heat, the sow fell, and the hunters hurled themselves at her. The dreadful eruption from an unknown world made her frantic, and she squealed and bucked, and the air was full of sweat and noise and blood and terror, and Roger ran up round the heap, prodding his spear wherever pig flesh appeared. Jack was on the top of the sow, stabbing downward with his knife. Roger found a lodgment for his point, and he began to push until he was leaning with his whole weight, and the spear moved forward inch by inch, and the terrified squealing became a high-pitched scream, and then Jack found the throat, and the hot blood spouted over his hands, and the sow collapsed under them, and they were heavy and fulfilled upon her. The butterflies still danced, preoccupied in the center of the clearing. At last, the immediacy of the kill subsided. The boys drew back. Jack stood up, holding out his hands. "Look!" He giggled and he flicked them, while the boys laughed at his reeking palms. And then Jack grabbed Morris and he rubbed the stuff all over his cheeks, and Roger began to withdraw his spear, and the boys noticed it for the first time. And Robert stabilized the thing in a phrase which was received uproariously. "Right up her ass!" Did you hear? Did you hear what he just said? Right up her ass! This time Robert and Morris acted the two parts, and Morris acting as the pig's effort to avoid the advancing spear was so funny that the boys cried with laughter. At length this paled. Jack began to clean his bloody hands on the rock, and then he started to work on the sow and paunched her, lugging out the hot bags of colored guts, pushing them into a pile on the rock, and the others watched him, and he talked while he worked. "We'll take the meat along the beach. I'll go back to the platform and invite them to a feast. That should give us some time." Roger spoke. "Chief? Huh? How can we make a fire?" Jack squatted back and frowned at the pig. "Well, we'll raid them and take fire. There must be 4 of you, Henry and you and Robert and Morris, and we'll put on paint and sneak up, and Roger can snatch a branch while I say what I want. The rest of you can get this back to where we were. We'll build the fire there. And after that..." He paused and stood up, looking at the shadows under the trees, and his voice was lower when he spoke again. "We'll leave part of the kill for..." He knelt down again and was busy with his knife. The boys crowded round him, and he spoke over his shoulder to Roger. "Sharpen a stick at both ends." Presently he stood up, holding the dripping sow's head in his hands. "Where's that stick?" "Here." "Ram one end in the earth." "Oh, it's rock. Here, jam it in that crack. There." And Jack held up the head and jammed the soft throat down on the pointed end of the stick, which pierced through into the mouth. He stood back, and the head hung there. A little blood was dribbling down the stick. Instinctively, the boys drew back too. The forest was very still. They listened, and the loudest noise was the buzzing of the flies over the spilled guts. Jack spoke in a whisper. "Pick up the pig." Morris and Robert skewered the carcass, lifted the dead weight, and stood ready. In the silence and the standing over the dry blood, they looked suddenly furtive. Jack spoke loudly. "This head is for the beast! It's a gift!" The silence accepted the gift and awed them. The head remained there, dim-eyed, grinning faintly, blood blackening between its teeth. All at once they were running away as fast as they could, through the forest and toward the open beach. Simon stayed where he was. A small brown image concealed by the leaves. Even if he shut his eyes, the sow's head still remained like an after-image. The half-shut eyes were dim with infinite cynicism of adult life. They assured Simon that everything was bad business. "Well, I know that." Simon discovered that he had spoken aloud. He opened his eyes quickly, and there was a head grinning amusedly in the strange daylight, ignoring the flies, the spilled guts, even ignoring the indignity of being spiked on a stick. He looked away, licking his dry lips. A gift for the beast. Might not the beast come for it? The head, he thought, appeared to agree with him. "Run away," said the head silently. "Go back to the others. It was just a joke, really. Why should you bother? You were just wrong, that's all. A little headache. Something you ate, perhaps." "Go back, child," said the head silently. Simon looked up, feeling the weight of his wet hair, and gazed up at the sky. Up there, for once, were clouds, great bulging towers that sprouted away over the island, grey and cream and copper-colored. The clouds were sitting on the land. They squeezed and produced, a moment by moment, this close, tormenting heat. Even the butterflies deserted the open space, where the obscene thing grinned and dripped. Simon lowered his head carefully, keeping his eyes shut, and then he sheltered them with his hands. There were no shadows under the trees, but everywhere a pearly stillness, so that there was a real, elusive, without definition. The pile of guts was a black blob of flies that buzzed like a saw, and after a while these flies found Simon, gorged, and they alighted by the runnels of sweat and drank. And they tickled under his nostrils and played leapfrog on his thighs, and they were black and iridescent green without number. And in front of Simon, the Lord of the Flies hung on his stick and grinned. At last Simon gave up and looked back and saw white teeth and dim eyes and the blood, and his gaze was held by that of an ancient, inescapable recognition, and in Simon's right temple a pulse began to beat on his brain. Ralph and Piggy lay in the sand, gazing at the fire and idly flicking pebbles into the smokeless heart. "That branch is gone. Where's Sam and Eric? We ought to get more wood. We're out of green branches." Ralph sighed and stood up. There were no more shadows under the palms on the platform, only this strange light that seemed to come from everywhere all at once. High up among the bulging clouds, thunder went off like a gun. "We're going to get buckets of rain." "What about the fire?" Rolf trotted into the forest and returned with a wide spray of green which he dumped on the fire. The branch crackled and the leaves curled and the yellow smoke expanded. Piggy made an aimless little pattern in the sand with his fingers. "Trouble is, we haven't got enough people for the fire. You got to treat Sam and Eric as one turn. They do everything together." "Of course." "Well, that isn't fair. Don't you see? They ought to do 2 turns." Ralph considered this and understood. He was vexed to find how little he thought like a grown-up, and sighed again. The island was getting worse and worse. Piggy looked at the fire. "You'll want another green branch soon." Ralph rolled over. "Piggy, what are we going to do?" "We'll just have to get on without them." "But the fire." He frowned at the black and white mess in which that lay unburnt ends of branches, and he tried to formulate. "I'm scared." He saw Piggy looked up and blundered on. Not of the beast. I mean, I'm scared of that too. But nobody else understands about the fire. If someone threw you a rope when you were drowning, if a doctor said, take this because if you don't, you're gonna die. Well, you would, wouldn't you? I mean, course I would. Well, can't they see? Can't they understand? Without a smoke signal, we'll die here. Well, look at that. A wave of heated air trembled up above the ashes, but without a trace of smoke. We can't keep one fire going, and they don't care. And what's more, he looked intensely into Piggy's streaming face. What's more, I don't sometimes. Supposing I got like the others, not caring. Well, what would become of us? Piggy took off his glasses, deeply troubled. I don't know, Ralph. We just got to go on, that's all. That's what grown-ups would do. Ralph, having begun the business of unburdening himself, continued. Piggy, what's wrong? Piggy looked at him in astonishment. Do you mean the... No, not it. I mean, what makes things break up like they do? Piggy rubbed his glasses slowly, and he thought. And when he understood how far Ralph had gone toward accepting him, he flushed pinkly with pride. I don't know, Ralph. I expect it's him. Jack? Jack. A taboo was evolving around that word, too. Ralph nodded solemnly. Yes, he said. I suppose it must be. And the forest near them burst into an uproar. Demonic figures with faces of white and red and green rushed out of the howling, so that a little one fled screaming. Out of the corner of his eye, Ralph saw Piggy running. Two figures rushed at the fire and prepared to defend himself, but they grabbed a half-burnt branch and raced away along the beach. The three others stood still, watching Ralph, and he saw that the tallest of them, stark naked save for the paint and the belt, was Jack. Ralph had his breath back and he spoke. Well? Jack ignored him, lifted his spear and began to shout. Listen, all of you! Me and my hunters! We're living along the beach by the flat rock. We hunt and feast and have fun, and if you want to join my tribe and see us, perhaps I'll let you join, and perhaps not. Paused and looked around. He was safe from shame and self-consciousness behind the mask of his paint, and he could look at each of them in turn. And Ralph was kneeling by the remains of the fire like a sprinter at his mark, and his face was half hidden by his hair and smut. And Sam and Eric peered together round the palm tree in the edge of the forest. A little howled, ceased, and crimson, and by the bathing pool Piggy stood on the platform, the white conch gripped in his hands. Tonight we're having a feast. We killed a pig and we got meat, and you can come and eat with us if you'd like. Up in the cloud canyons the thunder boomed again, and Jack and the two anonymous savages with him swayed, looking up, and then they recovered. The Litland went on howling, and Jack, waiting for something, he whispered urgently to the others. Go on! Now! The two savages murmured. Jack spoke sharply. Go on! The two savages looked at each other and raised their spear together and spoke in time. The chief has spoken! Then the three of them trotted away. Presently Ralph rose to his feet, looking at the place where the savages had vanished. Sam and Eric came, talking in an awed whisper. I thought it was... and I was... scared. Piggy stood above them on the platform, still holding the conch. That was Jack and Morris and Robert, said Ralph. Aren't they having fun? I thought I was going to have my asthma. Sucks to your asthma. When I saw Jack, I'd sure he'd go for the conch. Can't think why. The group of boys looked at the white shell with an affectionate respect. Piggy placed Ralph's hand in the Litland's. Seeing the familiar symbol, started to come back. Not here! He turned toward the platform, feeling the need for a ritual. First went Ralph, The white conch cradled, and then Piggy very grave, then the twins, and the Litlins, and then the others. Sit down, all of you. They raided us for fire. They're having fun. But the... Ralph paused. Ralph was puzzled by the shutter that flickered in his brain. There was something he wanted to say, and then a shutter had come down. But the... They were all regarding him gravely, yet troubled by any doubts about his sufficiency. Ralph pushed the idiot hair out of his eyes and looked at Piggy. But the... Oh, the fire! Of course, the fire! He started to laugh, and then he stopped, and he became fluent instead. The fire's the most important thing! Without the fire, we can't be rescued. I like to put on war paint and be a savage, but we must keep the fire burning. The fire's the most important thing on this island, because... He paused again. The silence became full of doubt and wonder. Piggy whispered urgently, Rescue! Oh, yes! Without the fire, we can't be rescued. So we must stay by the fire and make smoke. And when he stopped, no one said anything. And after the many brilliant speeches that had been on this very spot, Ralph's remarks seemed lame, even to the Litlins. At last, Builder held out his hand for the conch. Now, we can't have fire up there. Because we can't have fire up there, we need more people to keep it going. Let's go to this feast and tell them that the fire is hard on the rest of us. And that hunting and all that, being savages, I mean, it must be jolly good fun. Sam and Eric took the conch. That must be fun like Bill says. And he invited us to a feast. Meat, crackling. I could do with some meat. Ralph held up his hand. Why shouldn't we get our own meat? Twins looked at each other, and Bill answered. We don't want to go into the jungle. Ralph grimaced. He, goes. He's a hunter. They're all hunters. That's different. No one spoke for a moment. Then Piggy muttered to the sand. Meat. The Litlins sat, solemnly thinking of meat and dribbling. Overhead, the cannon boomed again, and the dry palm fronds clattered in the sudden gust of hot wind. So, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to the next symbol, the Lord of the Flies. Now, to give you some background information, the Lord of the Flies, translated from English into Hebrew, is the name Beelzebub, which is a Hebrew name for a demon or Satan. The Lord of the Flies, the Lord of Death, evil, that's represented in all mankind, that we as a group of human beings have the tendency to be selfish, have the tendency to be envious, have the tendency to be greedy. And so all these things lend us to doing things that are outside of what we would term morality. And again, going back to the Garden of Eden episode, when Adam and Eve were tempted by the serpent to do evil against God, to sin against God, so these boys have also been tempted to do evil, which they demonstrated in the killing of the pig. I don't know if you noticed, but before Jack slit the throat of the pig, Roger was torturing the pig that they were killing by taking his spear and shoving his spear into the anus of the pig while the pig was still alive and screaming and squealing. And so that kind of shows us the depths that these boys are going to in their attempt to hunt and have fun and kill. And as I mentioned before, the circle of protection around the boys is growing smaller and smaller and smaller. And so we're seeing that in this particular chapter. And then Jack cuts the head off the pig leaves it as a gift for the beast. He orders Roger to sharpen a stick at both ends, and he plants the head of the pig onto this stake. And this is now the Lord of the Flies, this Beelzebub, this evil that is represented, that's going on the island. And so Simon has his epileptic moment, and he's going to have a conversation in his mind with this pig's head on a stick, which is representative of this evil that is taking place on the island. "You are a silly little boy," said the Lord of the Flies. "Just an ignorant, silly little boy." Simon moved his swollen tongue but said nothing. "Don't you agree?" said the Lord of the Flies. "Aren't you just a silly little boy?" Simon answered him in the same silent voice. "Well then," said the Lord of the Flies, "you better run off and play with the others. They think you're batty." "You don't want Ralph to think you're batty, do you? You like Ralph, don't you? And Piggy. And Jack." Simon's head was tilted slightly up. His eyes could not break away from the Lord of the Flies that hung in space before him. "What are you doing out here all alone? Aren't you afraid of me?" Simon shook. "There isn't anyone to help you, only me, and I'm the beast." Simon's mouth labored, brought forth audible words. "Pig's head on a stick." "Fancy thinking the beast was something you could hunt and kill," said the head. For a moment or two, the forest and all the other dimly appreciated places echoed with this parody of laughter. "You knew, didn't you? I'm a part of you. Close, close, close! I'm the reason why it's no go. Why things are the way they are." The laughter shivered again. "Come now," said the Lord of the Flies. "Get back to the others, and we'll forget the whole thing." Simon's head wobbled. His eyes were half closed as though he were imitating the obscene thing on the stick. He knew that one of his times was coming on, and the Lord of the Flies was expanding like a balloon. "Well, this is ridiculous. You know perfectly well you'll only meet me down there. So don't you try to escape." Simon's body was arched and stiff, and the Lord of the Flies spoke in a voice of a schoolmaster. "Well, this has gone on quite far enough, my poor misguided child. Do you think you know better than I do?" There was a pause. "I'm warning you. I'm going to get angry, do you see? You're not wanted, understand? We're going to have fun on this island, understand? We're going to have fun on this island, and so you don't try it on, my poor misguided boy, or else." Simon found that he was looking into the vast mouth, and there was blackness from within, a blackness that spread. "Or else," said the Lord of the Flies, "we shall do you, see? Jack and Roger and Morris and Robert and Bill and Piggy and Ralph, do you see?" Simon was inside the mouth, and he fell down and lost consciousness.